There are films that entertain, and then there are films that leave a permanent mark on the human soul. E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial is firmly in the second category, and the reason it continues to reduce grown adults to tears more than 4 decades after its release has very little to do with special effects or studio budgets. It has everything to do with a series of extraordinarily deliberate decisions made behind the camera, decisions that most audiences have never heard of and would never suspect from simply watching the finished film. Steven Spielberg didn't stumble into greatness with this movie. He engineered it, protected it, and in several cases, fought for it against every commercial instinct Hollywood could throw at him. What follows is the full story of how one of cinema's most beloved films was actually made, and why so many of its most powerful moments almost never happen at all. The first secret is perhaps the most foundational, and it shaped everything that came after it. While the overwhelming majority of professional film productions shoot their scenes completely out of sequence, jumping between locations based on availability, budget constraints, and logistical efficiency, Spielberg made the radical and expensive decision to film E.T. in largely chronological order. This wasn't a sentimental choice or an indulgence. It was a precise creative strategy designed to accomplish something no amount of directing could manufacture artificially. He wanted the child actors to experience the emotional arc of the story in real time, building genuine relationships and genuine feelings as the weeks of production progressed, rather than being asked to perform emotions they hadn't yet earned. As filming moved forward, Henry Thomas, Robert McNaughton, and Drew Barrymore weren't pretending to care about a rubber puppet. They had spent weeks interacting with it daily, treating it as a presence in their lives, and the attachment that developed was as real as any relationship formed under ordinary circumstances. By the time cameras rolled on the farewell sequence, the exhaustion and grief on their faces carried the accumulated weight of an entire shoot's worth of authentic connection. No director's note could have produced what time itself delivered. What most audiences don't know is that the emotional foundation of this film wasn't just cinematic. It was deeply personal to its creator in ways that explained everything about why the story hit so hard. Spielberg's parents divorced when he was young, and the isolation he experienced during that period didn't disappear with adulthood. It transformed into something he carried quietly for years, a wound that shaped his imagination in ways he didn't fully understand until the concept for E.T. began to take form. He has spoken openly about how the absence of his father left a void that no ordinary companionship could fill, and E.T. wasn't conceived as a science fiction property or a creature feature designed to compete with the alien movies of its era. The character was born directly from that childhood longing, the desperate need for a friend who would never leave, never judge, and never choose sides in someone else's conflict. Every interaction between Elliot and the alien follows not the logic of a genre adventure, but the logic of a boy who needs to feel understood by someone who understands nothing about the world that has hurt him. That raw personal origin is what separates this film from every other alien story ever made, and is why audiences don't merely watch it unfold. They feel it somewhere specific and private in ways they often struggle to articulate even to themselves. Creating a creature that audiences would instinctively love before it spoke a single word required a level of psychological precision that went far beyond skilled puppetry or impressive costume work. The design team spent significant time studying what triggers emotional responses in human beings at the most instinctive level, examining the proportions of infant faces, the particular softness found in the eyes of elderly people, and the specific visual cues that signal fragility and vulnerability to the human brain without requiring any conscious interpretation. E.T.'s oversized eyes became the centerpiece of this strategy. They were engineered to activate the same protective instincts parents feel toward newborns, wide and deeply expressive, and carrying a persistent quality of sadness that seems to ask for nothing while communicating everything. Every proportion in the creature's face was calibrated not for biological plausibility, but for emotional impact, designed to bypass rational thought entirely and connect directly with something older and more primal. The result was a character that didn't need scientific accuracy to feel genuinely alive. Audiences around the world couldn't stop looking at those eyes, and they didn't want to, because something in those eyes recognized them back. What audiences see on screen as a single continuous character was actually assembled from multiple, entirely different sources, each used for specific types of shots depending on what a given scene demanded. Actors in full body suits provided convincing physical movement and presence for wide shots and walking sequences. Mechanical hands with extraordinary precision took over for close-ups requiring detailed finger movements or delicate gestures. Different rigs and different performers were employed constantly throughout production, each with their own technical limitations that the crew had to navigate and conceal. The real challenge wasn't making Edie move convincingly in isolated moments, but ensuring that all these fundamentally different versions felt like a single living creature from one shot to the next. Spielberg and his team solved this through meticulous camera placement, careful angle selection, and editing that controlled exactly what the audience saw and when they saw it. The illusion worked so completely that most viewers have spent decades watching the film without ever suspecting they were watching several entirely different versions of the same beloved character stitched together through the invisible art of cinematic craft. Among all the performances in the film, one stand apart in a way that reveals just how far Spielberg was willing to go to capture genuine emotion. 7-year-old Drew Barrymore was deliberately kept in a state of belief throughout the entire production, encouraged to think of E.T. as a real living creature rather than a mechanical puppet operated by a team of skilled technicians. Crew members treated the puppet as though it were genuinely alive whenever Barrymore was nearby. Conversations were held with E.T. between takes. Handlers stayed completely out of her sightlines, and every piece of equipment used to animate the creature was kept carefully hidden from her view. The goal was elegantly simple and extraordinarily effective. By preserving her capacity for genuine wonder, the camera could capture something no amount of coaching or repeated takes could replicate. Her scenes carry a quality that stands apart from typical child performances, a tenderness and trust so complete it reads less like acting and like direct documentation of a real child's love for something she genuinely believed was alive. Spielberg recognized early on that innocence was one of the most powerful creative instruments available to him, and protecting Barrymore's belief became one of the film's most quietly brilliant decisions. The visual language Spielberg chose for the film's first 2 acts was built around a deliberate and sophisticated strategy that most viewers absorb without ever consciously recognizing it. For much of the film, adult characters are presented not as protectors, but as looming, faceless threats, and this wasn't accidental. The decision to shoot adults from low angles, mimicking the physical perspective of a small child looking up at the world, turned ordinary grown-ups into something vaguely menacing without a single threatening line of dialogue. Faces were cropped out of frame or left in shadow. Adults appeared as legs, torsos, and hands rather than as individuals with recognizable humanity. The audience wasn't watching adults behave badly. They were experiencing what it feels like to be small and powerless in a world of giants who don't understand what matters to you. This strategy shifts with enormous precision in the film's final act, when Peter Coyote's character reveals genuine compassion, and the camera rises for the first time to meet an adult at eye level. That single physical adjustment signals a turning point not just in plot, but in the entire emotional architecture of the movie. Trust is communicated through camera height before a single word is spoken. The script that brought all of this to life arrived in a condition so unusual it remains almost unprecedented in Hollywood history. Screenwriter Melissa Matheson delivered a draft so emotionally precise and structurally sound that Spielberg famously described it as nearly ready to shoot the moment he read it, a statement that practically no director in the industry's history has ever been able to make honestly. Matheson's background gave her a specific advantage for this kind of story. She understood how to write children as complete human beings rather than as comic relief or miniature adults speaking precocious dialogue. Her rhythms captured the way children actually talk to each other, with all the interruptions and the logic and emotional directness that adults tend to filter out of their speech. The emotional beats moved from wonder to fear to heartbreak with a clarity and confidence that required almost nothing in the way of revision. Only minor adjustments were made before production began, mostly concerned with tightening the third act. There were no emergency rewrites, no panic story meetings, no structural overhauls. The discipline of that first draft gave the entire production a stable foundation that everyone involved could trust from the very first day of shooting. The voice that audiences associate with one of cinema's most memorable characters was never performed by a single person and never emerged from a single source. Sound designer Ben Burt assembled E.T.'s vocal identity from an extraordinary collection of recordings layered together until they created something simultaneously alien and deeply familiar. The foundational tone came from Pat Welsh, an elderly woman whose raspy, Weathered voice carried an organic fragility that no trained actor could have convincingly imitated. Bert discovered her by chance and immediately recognized that her voice contained the specific quality the character needed. Additional layers included animal vocalizations, Bert's own process recordings, and various manipulated sounds blended together with extraordinary care. The genius of this approach was that E.T.'s voice communicated emotion far more effectively than language ever could. When the creature speaks, audiences aren't responding to words. They're responding to the ache and longing embedded in the sound itself. Every strained syllable designed to bypass dialogue and connect directly with feeling. It remains one of the finest examples of sound design functioning not as technical craft, but as genuine performance. The sequence in which government agents invade Elliot's home and subject E.T. to medical procedures is among the most viscerally upsetting passages in the film. And the reason it hits so hard is that the fear on the children's faces was largely authentic. Spielberg deliberately withheld detailed information about how the scene would unfold, keeping the young cast in the dark about the specifics of what was coming. When the plastic tunnels went up around the set and actors in hazmat suits flooded the space that had been a familiar and comfortable environment for weeks, the children's confusion was genuine. The sudden transformation of a space they associated with safety into something sterile and hostile triggered real anxiety, and the cameras captured reactions that no amount of rehearsal could have manufactured. Wide eyes, trembling voices, and a palpable sense of violation that makes the sequence almost difficult to watch. By allowing the children to experience that emotional disruption authentically, Spielberg ensured that audiences would feel the same invasion of safety. The warmth of Elliot's home had been shattered, and every viewer felt it physically. One of the film's most iconic details carries within it a story that changed an entire industry and made one company spectacularly successful purely by accident. The original plan called for Elliot to use M&Ms to lure E.T. out of hiding, a logical and unremarkable choice that was already built into the script. When the Mars company declined the opportunity, reportedly uncertain about associating their product with an alien creature, production was forced to find an alternative quickly. Hershey agreed to allow Reese's Pieces to fill the role, and what followed became one of the most consequential product placement decisions in marketing history. Sales of the candy reportedly surged by extraordinary margins within weeks of the film's release. A product that had been struggling to find its audience became one of the most recognizable brands in America almost overnight. Beyond the commercial impact, the switch subtly altered the texture of the scene itself. The warm orange, yellow, and brown tones of Reese's Pieces blended naturally with the earthy palette of the forest and Elliot's home in ways that the cooler colors of M&Ms almost certainly would not have matched as effectively. Long before audiences fell in love with a gentle, wide-eyed alien, the project that would eventually become E.T. had its origins in something considerably darker. Spielberg had been developing a concept called Night Skies, a horror-inflected story about a family terrorized by a group of hostile extraterrestrials. The tone was closer to a siege thriller than a family drama, and the creatures were conceived to frighten rather than to charm. During the development of that darker project, one element kept pulling Spielberg's attention away from the horror elements. A subplot involving a single alien who befriends the family's youngest child. That quiet thread of connection felt more emotionally compelling than anything the scarier version had to offer, and Spielberg began to understand that the real story wasn't about fear at all. As the concept evolved, the creature's design softened in tandem with the story's emotional shift. Sharp features gave way to rounded and vulnerable proportions. Menace was replaced by fragility. That transformation came not from studio pressure or audience testing, but from a genuine creative evolution within Spielberg himself. A filmmaker following his instincts towards something more honest and more enduring than the genre piece he had originally intended to make. On most professional film productions, actors are expected to hit precise marks on the floor, tape indicators that ensure proper framing, focus, and lighting for every single shot. Spielberg abandoned that convention completely when working with his young cast, recognizing early on that forcing children to think consciously about where to stand would strip their performances of the very spontaneity that made them valuable. Instead of rigid choreography, he allowed the kids to move freely through scenes, reacting naturally to each other and to the E.T. puppet in whatever way felt genuine in the moment. This created enormous challenges for camera operators, who had to constantly adjust focus and reframe shots while anticipating the unpredictable movement of children who weren't performing to a predetermined plan. What would have been considered unacceptable on any standard production became the defining visual philosophy of this one. Certain shots may not have been technically flawless by conventional standards, but they carried something far more valuable than technical perfection. They captured the genuinely unscripted behavior of performers too young to convincingly fake what they were feeling. The bicycle chase sequence that serves as the film's climactic action set piece almost didn't work at all. Early assemblies of the footage felt flat and lifeless, lacking the tension and exhilaration the scene needed to function as the movie's emotional peak. The problem wasn't performances or the cinematography. It was the pacing, which initially followed the chase in a straightforward manner that robbed it of urgency and surprise. Spielberg and his editing team returned to the footage repeatedly, restructuring the sequence to create sharper contrast between hope and danger, experimenting with intercutting patterns, and searching for precise moments where acceleration would land with maximum impact. What ultimately rescued the scene arrived late in post-production, when John Williams' score transformed the raw footage into something genuinely transcendent. The music didn't merely accompany the chase. It drove it forward, telling audiences exactly when to hold their breath and when to release it. The soaring orchestral crescendo as the bikes lift into the sky against a full moon became one of cinema's most iconic moments, but it was built entirely on a foundation of editorial problem solving that nearly didn't come together in time. That image of the bicycle silhouetted against the moon, which has since become one of the most recognized frames in the history of cinema, and the logo of Spielberg's own production company, very nearly didn't exist. The shot was conceived relatively late in production, and Spielberg wasn't certain it would work either technically or emotionally. There was a genuine risk that it would look artificial or overly sentimental, undermining the grounded tone the film had worked so carefully to establish. Early attempts fell short of what Spielberg envisioned, as the technical demands accomplishing a practical bicycle rig against a backlit moon while maintaining believable scale proved more difficult than anticipated. The team went through multiple iterations, adjusting the size of the moon, the angle of the silhouette, and the speed of movement before landing on a version that felt simultaneously magical and credible within the film's emotional world. Spielberg's willingness to push forward despite genuine uncertainty about whether the shot would succeed is what made that moment possible, and his instinct to trust it produced the single most enduring visual legacy of his career. By the time production reached the sequence where Edie begins to fade away, the cast and crew had spent weeks building genuine emotional connections with the character and with each other through the chronological shooting process. Spielberg understood that the scene's power depended entirely on how real the grief felt, and he took deliberate steps to protect the emotional atmosphere on set throughout those filming days. The environment was kept unusually quiet, with typical between-takes chatter suppressed, and the mood held deliberately somber. For the child actors, who had spent the entire production bonding with the puppet in real time, the creature's decline felt less like a scripted event and more like something genuinely painful unfolding before them. Henry Thomas delivered what many consider the emotional peak of the entire film during the sequence, and the rawness of that performance wasn't manufactured through direction or coaching. It came from a place carefully cultivated over weeks of sequential shooting and authentic emotional investment. Spielberg hadn't needed to push his young star toward grief. He had built an entire production methodology that made that grief inevitable when the moment arrived. The clinical environment of the government facility where E.T. is taken wasn't simply a different set. It was a carefully constructed emotional counterworld designed to feel like entering an entirely different film. Production designer James Bissell stripped the space of every element that had made Elliot's home feel safe and warm. Soft lighting gave way to harsh fluorescence. Familiar furniture disappeared behind cold metal surfaces. The organic warmth of a lived-in house was replaced by uniform institutional walls and identical corridors. The costumes worn by the medical personnel were deliberately depersonalizing, with covered faces and gloved hands erasing any trace of individual humanity. Spielberg didn't need villainous dialogue or overtly threatening behavior to communicate danger. The set itself told audiences everything they needed to know. Walking from Elliot's bedroom into that sterile facility felt like watching warmth being surgically removed from a movie, and the visceral shock of that environmental shift made E.T.'s survival feel desperately urgent in a way that no conventional antagonist could have achieved. As production neared its final stages, Spielberg grew increasingly protective of the film's closing farewell sequence in ways that surprised even his closest collaborators. Acutely aware that studio executives might push for a more comfortable resolution if given early access, he took the unusual step of severely restricting who could see the ending before it was locked. Scripts for the closing sequence were numbered and tracked. Access was limited to a tight inner circle of trusted collaborators. The footage was kept separate from the general editing workflow and treated almost like classified material. This secrecy reflected something deeper than directorial ego. Spielberg genuinely believed that the ending's power lay in its willingness to cause real pain rather than manufactured comfort, and he knew that instinct would be nearly impossible to defend in a conference room full of people focused on commercial performance. By keeping the finale under wraps until it was too late to change, he ensured that his creative vision survived the one phase of Hollywood filmmaking most likely to destroy it. In standard filmmaking practice, composers write music to fit the rhythm and timing of a finished edit. For several key sequences in E.T., Spielberg and John Williams reversed this process entirely, allowing the score to be composed first, and then editing the footage to match the emotional arc of the music. Williams wrote sweeping, emotionally complex passages designed to capture specific feelings before the corresponding scenes were fully assembled. The editing team then shaped the visual rhythm around these compositions, cutting on musical beats, extending moments to let a melody breathe, and accelerating transitions to match orchestral surges. The result is a film where image and sound feel genuinely inseparable in ways that almost no other movie has ever achieved. Remove the score from the flying bicycle sequence or the final farewell, and the pacing of those scenes feels incomplete, because structurally they were built around the music rather than the other way around. Williams wasn't decorating the film with emotion. He was providing its heartbeat, and Spielberg was wise enough to let that heartbeat dictate how the entire story breathed. When the time came to sell the film to audiences, Universal made a bold and counterintuitive decision that went against every convention of science fiction marketing at the time. They chose to hide the alien almost entirely. The iconic poster featured two fingers touching against a starlit sky, promising warmth and intimacy rather than intergalactic spectacle. Trailers and promotional materials emphasized the bond between Elliot and his mysterious friend, while revealing as little of E.T.'s appearance as possible. The strategy positioned the film as a family story first and a science fiction film second, deliberately broadening its appeal far beyond the genre audience that would have shown up for another creature feature. Parents who would never take their children to see something marketed as an alien movie felt entirely comfortable bringing them to what looked like a heartfelt coming-of-age story. The marketing didn't misrepresent the film. It simply understood what the film actually was better than any conventional campaign could have. The movie wasn't about an alien. It was about a feeling, and the campaign had the intelligence and the courage to sell exactly that. One of the most radical storytelling decisions Spielberg made was also one of the quietest. The question of where E.D. comes from, what species he belongs to, what biological systems sustain him, what purpose brought him to Earth, is never answered. In a genre obsessed with world-building and elaborate mythology, this refusal to explain was an act of extraordinary narrative discipline. The reasoning was intuitive rather than calculated. Spielberg understood that the moment you explain a mystery, you diminish it. Giving E.T. a detailed backstory would have transformed the character from an emotional presence into an intellectual exercise, shifting audiences from feeling to analyzing. By leaving those questions permanently unanswered, Spielberg handed the story's deeper meaning over to audiences themselves. Every viewer filled in the gaps differently, projecting their own loneliness and longing for connection onto the creature's mysterious origins. E.D. became a mirror rather than a character study, and that deliberate openness is a significant part of why the film continues to resonate across generations and cultures in ways that more precisely defined stories simply cannot. Before the film reached wide release, early test screenings produced reactions that stunned even the most optimistic members of the production team. Audiences didn't simply enjoy the movie. They responded with an emotional intensity that executives and filmmakers described as unlike anything they had witnessed in their careers. The film received an A+ cinema score, a rating so rare that only a handful of movies in the entire history of the measurement have ever achieved it. What made these reactions particularly remarkable was their absolute consistency. A single overwhelming screening can be explained by a receptive crowd or favorable conditions, but this film produced the same response every time it was shown to a new audience, without a single exception across every demographic and age group. Studio executives who had harbored quiet doubts about the film's commercial viability found themselves confronting the reality that they were sitting on something that didn't merely entertain people, but fundamentally moved them in ways that defied easy explanation. When production reached the final farewell between Elliot and E.T., Spielberg made a decision that surprised nearly everyone on set. Rather than shooting extensive coverage from multiple angles over several days of filming, he moved through the sequence with remarkable speed and economy, capturing the material in a small number of takes with discipline that seemed at odds with how emotionally critical the scene was to everything the film had built. The reasoning came from a deep understanding of how children process intense feeling. Asking his young actors to cry, say goodbye, and access genuine grief repeatedly over extended filming days would inevitably lead to emotional exhaustion and diminishing returns. Each subsequent take would feel slightly less authentic than the one before it, and the fragile rawness that made the scene work would gradually be replaced by the mechanical performance of learned behavior. By keeping the take count low and moving efficiently, Spielberg preserved something irreplaceable: the first honest wave of real feeling from performers who had spent an entire production earning exactly this moment. The remarkable pace of the overall production surprised nearly everyone involved. What had been planned as a standard shooting schedule compressed significantly, with scenes being completed faster than anticipated, and entire shooting days wrapping well ahead of their planned timelines. On any ordinary production, that kind of acceleration would suggest corners being cut or quality being sacrificed. Here the opposite occurred. The compressed timeline eliminated the luxury of overthinking and forced Spielberg and his team to trust their first creative instincts rather than second-guessing themselves into safer and more predictable choices. The entire crew developed a focused energy that kept momentum constant. What emerged from those constraints was a film of extraordinary economy, with almost no scene that lingers past its usefulness and no subplot that wanders without resolution. The tight schedule didn't just save resources. It sharpened the entire production into something more purposeful and precise than unlimited time and money might ever have produced.